In the winter of 1917, Russia was still fighting the largest war in its history. And yet, in many ways, the war no longer felt like the most immediate danger. The front lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Millions of men were still under arms. On maps, the empire looked vast, intact, formidable. But beneath that surface, the system holding it together was failing not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, day by day. Trains ran late. Then they stopped running at all. Bread arrived sporadically. Then it didn't arrive. Orders were issued, but fewer people followed them. Authority existed on paper, but less so in practice. Russia's problem was not ideology. It was exhaustion. Years of war had strained every institution at once. The army consumed manpower faster than it could be trained or equipped. The railways buckled under military demand. Cities swelled with workers who could not be fed reliably. The government responded slowly, hesitantly, often in denial. This was a state built for scale, not resilience. Its size masked its fragility. When pressure mounted, there were no shock absorbers, no flexible institutions, no trusted intermediaries between ruler and ruled. Everything was centralized and everything was overloaded. By 1917, the war had hollowed out the space between command and compliance. Soldiers still wore uniforms, but belief was fading. Civilians still stood in line, but patience was gone. The system continued to function, but only barely, and only until something pushed it just a little too far. What followed is often described as a revolution. In reality, it was two. The first was not driven by ideology or grand plans. It emerged from hunger, cold, and frustration. It was improvised, chaotic, and deeply human. The second would be something else entirely organized, intentional, and ruthless in its clarity. Both were made possible by the war, and both reshaped the conflict more decisively than any battle Russia would fight that year. This episode is not about how revolution begins. It is about how a state collapses when it can no longer absorb strain. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, episode 11. In this episode, we'll follow Russia as the pressure finally breaks first in the streets of Petrograd, then in the halls of power, and we'll see how a war meant to defend an empire instead unravels it from within. Russia did not reach collapse suddenly. It wore its way there. From the outside, the Russian war effort looked immense. Millions of men mobilized, vast territories defended, endless reserves of manpower drawn from a population that stretched across continents. In sheer scale, Russia appeared resilient, even formidable. In reality, that scale hid a dangerous weakness. Russia was built to be large, not flexible. Its institutions could expand, but they struggled to adapt. When pressure increased, they did not bend, they cracked. The Russian army was enormous, but its infrastructure lagged far behind its ambitions. Mobilization brought men to the front faster than weapons, ammunition, or food could follow. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across poor roads and overburdened railways. Trains designed for peacetime commerce were suddenly expected to sustain modern industrial war. They could not. Rail coordination broke down early. Military shipments crowded out civilian transport. Grain piled up in rural areas while cities went hungry. Coal sat unused while factories and homes went cold. Every bottleneck fed the next. At the front, the strain was immediate and brutal. Russian forces suffered repeated defeats in the opening years of the war, often against better equipped and better coordinated enemies. Soldiers arrived without rifles and were told to pick them up from the fallen. Artillery units rationed shells. Medical services were overwhelmed. Leadership suffered as well. Officer casualties were high, and replacements were rushed and unevenly trained. The chain of command weakened as experienced leaders disappeared and authority became inconsistent. Orders arrived late, contradicted one another, or failed to reflect conditions on the ground. Morale followed predictably. A soldier could endure hardship if he believed it served a purpose. But repeated losses, inadequate support, and unclear objectives eroded that belief. The war began to feel less like defense and more like waste. Behind the lines, civilian life deteriorated in parallel. Cities grew rapidly as workers were drawn into war industries, but food systems failed to keep pace. Bread shortages became routine. Long lines formed outside bakeries, especially during winter when fuel shortages compounded misery. Inflation accelerated. Wages lagged behind rising prices. A day's pay bought less food each month. Families spent hours waiting for supplies that might not arrive at all. The winter cold turned inconvenience into crisis. Fuel shortages meant unheated homes and factories. Transportation failures meant that even available resources could not be distributed reliably. These were not isolated problems. They reinforced one another. Food shortages fueled unrest. Unrest disrupted production. Disrupted production worsened shortages. The system entered a feedback loop it could not escape. The political response only deepened the damage. Tsar Nicholas II made a fateful decision when he assumed personal command of the army. Intended to project authority and commitment, the move had the opposite effect. It tied the monarchy directly to military failure while removing the Tsar from the capital at a moment when political stability mattered most. With the Tsar at the front, governance in Petrograd fell increasingly to an unpopular and distrusted court. Ministers came and went, policies shifted without coherence, corruption rumors spread, confidence evaporated. The government appeared distant, incompetent, and indifferent. As failures accumulated, credibility collapsed. People did not need revolutionary ideology to recognize dysfunction. They experienced it daily in empty shops, delayed trains, and unanswered petitions. The state felt absent where it was needed most, and oppressive where it was least effective. Psychological exhaustion settled in. For soldiers, faith in the war's purpose faded. Letters from home spoke of hunger and hardship. Sacrifice no longer felt reciprocal. Desertion increased. Obedience weakened. The emotional contract between state and soldier frayed. For civilians, trust eroded just as steadily. Loyalty to the Tsar had been personal and symbolic. When that symbol failed to protect or provide, it left nothing in its place. There were no robust civic institutions to absorb disappointment, no channels for peaceful redress. The state had asked for endurance. It had not provided reassurance. What made Russia's collapse different from that of other powers was not suffering alone. All the belligerents endured hardship. Britain faced shortages. France bled at Verdun. Germany starved under blockade. Russia lacked the institutional buffers that allowed other societies to endure longer. There was no effective coordination between military and civilian needs, no trusted political middle ground, no mechanism for reform that did not threaten the entire system. Every problem became existential. When pressure increased, there was nowhere for it to go. By 1917, Russia had not yet lost the war militarily, but it had lost coherence. The army still existed. The government still issued decrees. Factories still produced unevenly, inefficiently, and under strain. Everything functioned until it didn't. Collapse, when it came, was not the result of a single decision or a single protest. It was the consequence of a system that demanded endurance from every part of society without providing the means to sustain it. No institution bent. All of them broke. Petrograd in the winter of 1917 was still, technically, the capital of a great empire. On paper, it was a city of ministries, palaces, and authority. It housed the government, it housed the court. It housed the bureaucratic machinery that was supposed to coordinate a war stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was also one of Russia's most important industrial centers, packed with factories producing weapons, uniforms, and supplies that the front desperately needed. It should have been the strongest place in the country. Instead, it was one of the most fragile. Petrograd's importance made it symbolic. But symbolism does not keep a city fed, and it does not keep it warm. The war had strained the capital in ways that were easy for officials to dismiss in reports, but impossible for ordinary people to ignore in daily life. Winter arrived early and stayed late. Temperatures dropped, and with them came a quiet crisis that most histories treat as background fuel. Coal shortages were not dramatic in the way a battle was dramatic, but they were relentless. Coal-powered trains, coal-powered factories, coal-heated apartments. When coal deliveries faltered, everything else began to wobble. Buildings went cold, factories slowed, transport became unreliable. People started making calculations that felt small at first and then grew into something more dangerous. How long can we endure this? Transportation failures amplified the problem. The rail network, already overburdened by military demands, was breaking down under strain. Trains ran late, then stopped arriving at predictable intervals, and eventually became a kind of rumor themselves. Someone heard a shipment was coming, someone's cousin said it arrived at a different station, someone swore the train had been diverted for the army. And this is where war pressure becomes psychologically corrosive. When a system functions imperfectly, people complain, but they adapt. When it becomes erratic, they lose trust. If you cannot predict whether bread will arrive, you cannot plan your day. And if you cannot plan your day, you stop believing anyone is in control. Food was the center of everything. Petrograd depended on supplies arriving from outside the city, and those supplies were now competing with the front. Grain moved across the country less reliably than it had in peacetime. Flour deliveries became inconsistent. Bakeries ran out. The government introduced rationing and promised stability. In practice, rationing became its own form of chaos. Bread lines formed before dawn. Long lines of people wrapped in coats, stamping their feet against the cold, waiting for doors to open. Some waited for hours only to be told the shipment hadn't arrived. Others reached the front of the line just in time to watch the last loaf disappear. When bread did arrive, it often arrived unevenly, with one district receiving more than another and no one able to explain why. That unfairness mattered as much as hunger itself. Because hunger can be endured if it feels temporary and shared, while hunger becomes anger when it feels arbitrary and humiliating. A mother waiting in line did not need political theory to recognize injustice. She could feel it in her bones as she watched officials ride past in heated carriages while she returned home empty-handed. Rumors spread faster than facts. They always do in crisis, but Petrograd was especially vulnerable because trust in official information was already thin. People whispered about hoarded grain, about sabotage, about corrupt officials diverting supplies, about merchants deliberately withholding food to raise prices. Some rumors were false, some were partly true. In a city where the state's credibility had collapsed, it hardly mattered. The rumors felt plausible because the system was visibly failing. The war made all of this worse, not only through shortages, but through the sense of endlessness. In earlier crises, people could endure if they believed there was an end point, some clear future moment when normal life would return. By 1917, that confidence was gone. The war was no longer framed as a temporary emergency. It was a condition of life. It had consumed too much already, and it was still demanding more. Industrial workers felt this pressure sharply. Petrograd's factories ran long hours, producing supplies for an army that seemed to swallow everything without improving. Workers faced dangerous conditions, rising prices, and wages that could not keep pace. Many had family members at the front. Many received letters describing hunger in villages and confusion in the trenches. War fatigue ceased to be an idea and became a daily lived reality. Factory stoppages began to appear, sometimes as organized strikes and sometimes as spontaneous walkouts triggered by a shortage, a rumor, or a wage dispute. A late shipment of bread could shut down a production line. A manager's careless comment could spark a confrontation. A new set of rules could be interpreted as another insult piled onto years of endurance. What made these stoppages politically dangerous was that grievances were merging. A worker might begin the day angry about wages and end the day furious about the war. A breadline might begin as a logistical problem and end as a collective expression of resentment. This convergence mattered because it created a shared sense that the problem was not one policy or one shortage. The problem was the system. And yet, from the perspective of many officials, the capital still looked manageable. Reports framed bread shortages as temporary. Strikes were treated as isolated incidents. Discontent was blamed on agitators rather than conditions. The bureaucracy moved slowly, issuing decrees and adjusting ration allotments while failing to understand that the city's psychological state had shifted. Detachment became fatal. Because when a government speaks the language of routine while the population lives the reality of crisis, people stop hearing the government as legitimate. Official statements begin to sound like mockery. Promises begin to sound like lies. Even when an official is sincere, the gap between words and lived experience becomes unbearable. Petrograd was also a city of symbols, and symbols can become liabilities. It was the seat of state power, but that meant every failure felt like an indictment. If the capital could not be fed, what did that say about the empire? If the capital could not be heated, what did that say about the war effort? If the capital could not be governed coherently, what did that say about the Tsar himself? The city held the nerve center of the state, and the nerves were fraying. What made Petrograd a tinderbox before revolution ever began was not ideology, and it was not even hunger alone. It was the collapse of predictability. It was the erosion of trust. It was the merging of grievances into a single feeling that the system was no longer competent, no longer responsive, and no longer worthy of obedience. This is the crucial point. This is not yet a revolution. No one has seized power. No one has declared a new regime. There is not yet a single spark that turns resentment into mass action. What exists instead is something more subtle and, in some ways, more dangerous. A city stretched past its limits, still functioning on paper while failing in reality. War does not cause rebellion directly. It destroys the systems that prevent it. A population can endure suffering. What it cannot endure indefinitely is the sense that suffering is pointless, unmanaged, and imposed by a state that no longer deserves loyalty. By late winter, Petrograd had become a place where one more shortage, one more delay, one more misjudged order could push the city over the edge. And the officials tasked with keeping order did not fully grasp how close they were. It began the way so many crises begin, not with ideology, not with manifestos, but with a line, a breadline, winding through cold streets, filled with people who had already waited too long, too many times, and who no longer believed the situation was temporary. Petrograd had been stretched past its limits for months, and now, in late winter, the city's patience was as thin as its fuel supply. On the 23rd of February, 1917 International Women's Day, by the old calendar, women moved from waiting to marching. This matters because the first large demonstrations were not planned by professional revolutionaries. They were driven by ordinary life. Women who managed households, who stood in lines for food, who carried the daily burden of scarcity, walked out into the streets demanding bread. Some were textile workers, some were wives of soldiers. Some were simply exhausted. The slogans were blunt: bread, warmth, an end to the war. And once those demands were spoken aloud in public, the city responded like dry timber to a spark. The next day, more people joined. The protests spread from breadlines to factories, and factories were Petrograd's heartbeat. When workers stopped working, the city's rhythms changed. Entire plants shut down. Thousands poured into the streets. The crowd grew not because everyone shared the same ideology, but because everyone shared the same strain. Hunger merged with war fatigue. War fatigue merged with resentment. Resentment merged with the growing feeling that the government was not merely failing, but absent. Officials tried to interpret the unrest as a temporary disturbance. They treated it like noise. But by the time they recognized it as danger, it had already become momentum. Petrograd's police were deployed to suppress demonstrations. At first, repression followed familiar patterns: arrests, baton charges, attempts to break crowds into smaller, manageable groups. Authorities assumed that a show of force would restore order, because in the old Russia, it usually had. This time was different. Not because the police were suddenly weak, but because the scale of unrest was beyond what policing could contain. The crowds were too large, the city too tense, the anger too close to the surface. The government issued orders to restore control, and those orders inevitably brought the military into the story. This is the hinge point. This is where protest becomes revolution. Troops were called in. Young conscripts and reserve units, many of them exhausted by the war, many of them hungry themselves, were ordered to fire on civilians if necessary. At first, some did. Shots were fired. People fell. The state tried to remind Petrograd that it still possessed force. But force is only power if it is reliable. And in those days, reliability shattered. Soldiers hesitated. Some refused to fire, some aimed high, some turned away. The moral weight of firing on civilians, on women, on workers, on people who looked like their own families collided with the strain they had carried for years. They were not simply choosing between obedience and disobedience. They were choosing between preserving an order that had failed them and joining a crowd that felt, increasingly, like the only honest expression of reality. Mutiny did not arrive as one unified act. It came in fragments. A unit refuses an order. Another argues. A sergeant hesitates. A soldier lowers his rifle. A commander tries to assert discipline and finds that his authority has evaporated. Once one unit breaks, others begin to imagine breaking as well. This is what makes the collapse so fast. Authority is contagious when it works, and disobedience is contagious when it spreads. Within days, Petrograd had moved from demonstrations to something more dangerous: armed defection. Some soldiers turned on their officers. Others seized weapons depots. Crowds and troops began to merge. Fraternization soldiers talking with protesters, listening, nodding, joining, became visible on the streets. The old boundary between state power and popular unrest dissolved. The police, suddenly isolated, faced a reality they were not built to handle. In earlier moments of unrest, police could act as the sharp edge of authority, backed by an army that would enforce their actions. Now, the army was unreliable. And when the army becomes unreliable, police power becomes a liability rather than a solution. Police stations were attacked. Officers went into hiding, some discarded uniforms. The visible presence of authority began to vanish, not because the government ordered it to, but because it could not sustain it. Petrograd entered a strange moment that appears again and again in collapsing states: the sensation of sudden freedom paired with sudden uncertainty. People moved through the streets realizing that the rules were changing faster than anyone could explain. Some felt exhilaration, others felt fear, most felt both. In the capital, government offices struggled to function. Ministers argued, orders were drafted and contradicted. Some officials believed force could still be restored. Others realized that force had already failed. This paralysis mattered, because revolution is not only the presence of rebellion, it is the absence of effective response. As authority disintegrated, new power structures formed. Workers and soldiers began organizing councils, Soviets, to coordinate demands and maintain order in their own terms. The Petrograd Soviet emerged as a legitimate center of authority, not because it was officially recognized at first, but because it represented the people who were now shaping events on the ground. At the same time, members of the Duma, Russia's parliament, attempted to form a provisional government to restore stability and preserve some form of continuity. These two structures, Soviet and provisional government, would soon exist in uneasy parallel, embodying the contradictions of a country trying to govern itself after centuries of autocracy. But before any political arrangement could stabilize, the monarchy itself had to face what had become undeniable. The Tsar was no longer in control. Nicholas II, away from Petrograd and already tied personally to the failures of the war effort, received reports that grew more alarming by the hour. His initial instinct was to reassert authority, to send troops, to restore order, to treat the unrest as temporary. He did not fully grasp that Petrograd's problem was not disorder. It was a collapse of obedience. The critical fact was this: the state no longer had a monopoly on force. When the army refuses orders, the state stops being a state in the modern sense. It becomes a symbol without enforcement. It can still issue commands, but those commands travel into air that no longer carries them. Within days, the situation reached its political conclusion. Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty's centuries of imperial rule ended not with a glorious defeat on the battlefield, but with the quiet, almost administrative recognition that the Tsar no longer had the means to govern. It is difficult to overstate what that meant. Russia did not simply experience protests. It experienced the collapse of the structure that had defined its political identity. And it happened faster than almost anyone expected. Revolution succeeds not because protesters win, but because the army stops obeying. That is the February Revolution's central lesson. The crowds mattered. Hunger mattered. Anger mattered. But the decisive moment was the refusal of soldiers to fire, because in that refusal, the state lost the one tool that could have restored the old order. Once that tool was gone, a new Russia became possible, and a new kind of chaos became inevitable. The February Revolution ended autocracy. It did not end the war. In the months that followed the abdication of Nicholas II, Russia entered an unstable in-between state no longer ruled by a czar, but not yet governed by a system capable of meeting the pressures placed upon it. Power shifted into the hands of the Provisional Government, a body formed from members of the Duma and liberal political elites who believed that Russia could be reformed without tearing itself apart. They inherited a country in crisis and a war they could not escape. From the beginning, the Provisional Government faced a dilemma with no clean solution. If it continued the war, it risked alienating a population that was already exhausted, angry, and skeptical of authority. If it left the war, it risked diplomatic isolation, economic collapse, and the loss of support from its allies, particularly Britain and France, who depended on Russia to keep pressure on Germany in the east. In theory, the Provisional Government represented moderation and responsibility. In practice, it represented delay. Its leaders believed that Russia needed time to draft a constitution, time to hold elections, time to stabilize the economy. They feared that radical change would fracture the country further. Reform, they argued, must be gradual. The war made that impossible. Every week that Russia remained at war meant more casualties, more shortages, and more resentment. The army, already fragile, continued to deteriorate. Discipline eroded. Desertions increased. Soldiers questioned orders not out of ideology, but out of exhaustion and disbelief that the sacrifices demanded of them still served any purpose. Attempts to revive the war effort only deepened the crisis. In the summer of 1917, the Provisional Government authorized a major offensive, hoping that military success would restore morale and legitimacy. The logic was familiar. Victory would unify the country, strengthen the government, and prove Russia's reliability as an ally. The result was catastrophic. The offensive collapsed almost immediately. Units refused to advance. Others advanced briefly and then retreated. Losses mounted, confidence evaporated. Instead of restoring authority, the failure confirmed what many soldiers and civilians already believed, that the government did not understand the depth of the problem. The war had become a liability that no political maneuver could disguise. At the same time, the Provisional Government faced pressure from below. Workers demanded better conditions and greater control over factories. Soldiers demanded peace and accountability. Peasants demanded land reform. None of these demands were inherently revolutionary, but taken together, they required decisive action. Decisive action was precisely what the provisional government could not deliver. Its legitimacy rested on compromise. Its authority depended on restraint. It feared alienating conservatives by acting too boldly and feared provoking radicals by acting too slowly. As a result, it satisfied no one. This paralysis created space. Into that space stepped the Bolsheviks. At first, they were not the dominant political force. They lacked broad national support and were viewed by many as fringe agitators. What they possessed, however, was clarity. Their slogans were simple: peace, land, bread. They did not promise gradual reform. They promised immediate change. Most importantly, they promised to end the war. In a society exhausted by years of sacrifice, that promise mattered more than ideology. The Bolsheviks understood something the provisional government did not. Legitimacy no longer flowed from institutions. It flowed from alignment with lived experience. And lived experience told Russians that the war was unbearable. As the months passed, the provisional government's position weakened further. It governed alongside the Petrograd Soviet in an arrangement often described as dual power, an unstable balance between formal authority and popular legitimacy. This balance could not last. Every crisis exposed the government's dependence on forces it did not control. Every delay reinforced the perception that it lacked resolve. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks refined their strategy, focusing not on mass persuasion alone, but on strategic positioning. When the October Revolution came, it did not resemble the chaos of February. It was calculated. Armed groups loyal to the Bolsheviks seized key points in Petrograd bridges, communication centers, government buildings. The provisional government was isolated, outmaneuvered, and largely undefended. Resistance was limited, not because the Bolsheviks were universally popular, but because few were willing to fight for a government that had failed to deliver peace, stability, or food. The seizure of power was swift. The implications were immediate. Once in control, the Bolsheviks moved quickly to reframe the war. What had been a national obligation became an imperial mistake. What had been framed as defense became exploitation. The priority shifted overnight. Ending the war was no longer negotiable. It was essential. Negotiations with Germany began almost at once. The terms were harsh. Russia lost territory, it lost influence, it accepted humiliation in exchange for withdrawal. From a military and diplomatic perspective, the cost was staggering. From the perspective of survival, it was unavoidable. The war had become incompatible with the new political reality. This is the crucial point. Revolution did not end the war. It exposed how impossible continuing it had become. The provisional government failed not because it lacked good intentions, but because it tried to preserve a system that no longer matched the conditions created by total war. It attempted to govern a collapsing society with the tools of gradual reform, and those tools were no longer sufficient. The Bolsheviks succeeded not because they were inevitable, but because they aligned their priorities with the most urgent demand of the moment: an end to suffering. Russia's exit from the war reshaped the conflict overnight. Germany could shift forces west. The Eastern Front collapsed. The balance of the war changed. But inside Russia, the consequences were even more profound. The war that had broken the state was over. The struggle to rebuild something in its place was only beginning. Imagine a conscript on the Eastern Front in the spring of 1917. He is not a famous officer, not a political thinker, not a man whose name will appear in textbooks. He is a farmer's son, pulled into uniform by the machinery of a state that promised duty and delivered exhaustion. He has been away from home for months, perhaps years. He has watched units dissolve, watched officers vanish, watched the war consume men in ways that no one fully explained. He's far from home, and the distance feels larger now, because the country he left behind is not the country he is hearing about in letters. The front is quiet in the way exhausted fronts become quiet. Not peaceful, just depleted. The trench line is shallow and half collapsed, patched with rotting boards and frozen earth. His boots are stiff with mud. His coat is thin. His rifle is old. He is not sure whether there will be ammunition when the next attack comes, because there hasn't always been ammunition before. The war has trained him out of optimism. Supplies arrive irregularly, and when they arrive, they are never enough. Bread is dark and stale. Meat is rare. Tea is thin. Sometimes the men argue over rations, not because they are cruel, but because hunger makes small things feel like survival. The officers are different now. Some are competent, some are terrified, some are absent. In earlier months, obedience felt automatic. Orders came from above. You followed them because the system was intact, because punishment was certain, because belief still existed, belief in the Tsar, belief in Russia, belief that suffering would be rewarded with victory or at least with meaning. Now, meaning has dissolved. The conscript hears rumors before he hears facts. Rumors move faster than official messages, and official messages are no longer trusted anyway. Someone says the Tsar is gone. Someone says Petrograd is in chaos. Someone says the government has changed again. Someone swears the war will end soon, while another insists the generals are planning a new offensive. The problem is not ignorance. The problem is uncertainty. And uncertainty is corrosive when men are already exhausted. One afternoon, a letter arrives. It has traveled a long way. The paper is creased and dirty, handled by too many hands. It is written in familiar handwriting. Home. He reads it slowly, because every line carries weight. His mother writes about bread lines in the nearest town. She writes about the price of flour, about how money buys less each week, about how they burn scraps of wood because coal is scarce. She mentions a neighbor's son who never returned. She mentions a younger sibling coughing in the cold. She says the village talks endlessly about when the war will end because no one can endure another winter like the last. The letter does not contain ideology. It contains pressure, and as he reads it, something shifts inside him. The war is no longer only his suffering. It is also his family's suffering, and now the sacrifice feels lopsided. He is starving and freezing at the front, while his family is starving and freezing at home. And for what? For a government that no longer exists? For a czar who abdicated? For generals who still speak of victory as if words can conjure food and ammunition? For allies in the West who will never know his name? He folds the letter and puts it away, but it does not leave him. It sits in his chest like weight. A few days later, orders come down the line. The wording is formal, the tone familiar, as if nothing has changed. Prepare for movement. Be ready. Maintain discipline. The language assumes obedience because it has always assumed obedience. But now the conscript looks at the officer delivering the order and realizes something dangerous. The officer is unsure too. He speaks with authority because that is his role, but the role feels thinner. The men around the conscript glance at one another. Someone mutters. Someone laughs without humor. Someone asks a question that no one answers. And then there is the other pressure. The pressure from the men themselves. In earlier months, the group enforced obedience. The fear of being singled out, punished, shamed, that fear kept people in line. Now, the group is shifting toward a different kind of enforcement. The men talk openly about refusing. They talk about going home. They talk about what Petrograd means, about what it proves, about how officers can no longer punish an entire unit if the entire unit says no. The conscript feels the ground moving beneath him, and he understands that the most important question is no longer, what is the enemy doing? It is, what are we doing? If he refuses orders, he risks punishment, but punishment depends on a functioning system. If he obeys orders, he risks death for a purpose he no longer believes in. If he deserts, he risks being hunted, but he also risks nothing more than what he is already risking every day: hunger, cold, and the possibility of dying far from home. And layered over all of this is a quiet moral confusion. He was taught that obedience was virtue, and now obedience feels like complicity in something broken. He was taught that desertion was shame, and now desertion feels like logic. He was taught that the war was national survival, and now the nation itself seems to be dissolving. One night, the men around him talk in low voices. They share rumors, they argue. Some want to keep fighting because they fear what will happen if Germany advances. Others want to stop because they fear what will happen if the war continues. The conscript listens more than he speaks because he is not certain of anything anymore, and certainty is rare. Then, another letter arrives. Or maybe it is the same one, reread. Or maybe it is simply the memory of home. He thinks about his village. He thinks about the fields that will need planting. He thinks about whether his younger sibling will have bread next week. He thinks about whether his mother is standing in another line in the cold. And he thinks about the officer's order. He realizes that the order is still written as if Russia is unchanged, as if the state is intact, as if authority flows normally from the top down. But the men do not feel that flow anymore. They feel only demand, and the demand is no longer paired with legitimacy. This is where wars end. Not when treaties are signed, not when politicians announce victory or defeat. Wars end when soldiers stop believing in them because belief is the fuel that makes endurance possible. And once belief is gone, discipline becomes an act of force rather than consent, and force is expensive. The conscript does not need a theory to understand this. He can see it in the faces around him. He can hear it in the tone of conversations. He can feel it in the hesitation that spreads through the line whenever an order is given. In the morning, the unit is told to assemble. The officer speaks again. The words are the same kind of words that have been spoken for years. But the men stand differently now. Some shift their feet. Some look away. Some stare back. Someone asks a direct question, the kind that would once have been unthinkable. Why? The officer answers poorly because there is no good answer left. And in that moment, the conscript understands that his choice is no longer private. It is collective. If the unit refuses, the war ends for them, regardless of what generals want. If the unit obeys, the war continues, regardless of what the people want. The choice is not heroic. It is not romantic. It is survival. He looks down at his hands. He thinks about home. He thinks about the war's emptiness. He thinks about the word duty and how hollow it sounds when the state that demanded it can no longer feed its people. Then he lifts his gaze. And he decides, not because he is brave, not because he is cowardly, but because the war has demanded too much for too long while giving him less and less reason to believe. In this episode, we watch Russia collapse from the inside out, not because it lost a decisive battle, but because the war demanded more than the state could give. Years of fighting hollowed out every institution at once. The army endured shortages, defeats, and exhaustion. Cities endured hunger, cold, and uncertainty. The government endured a slow erosion of credibility until authority existed mostly on paper. What finally broke Russia was not ideology. It was war exhaustion. The February Revolution showed how fragile power becomes when obedience disappears. Protest turned into revolution, not because crowds overwhelmed the state, but because the army refused to enforce it. Once that happened, centuries of autocratic rule ended almost overnight. The provisional government that followed inherited an impossible situation. It tried to reform without rupturing, to continue the war without legitimacy, and to govern through compromise while the country demanded relief. Its failure revealed a hard truth. The war could no longer be sustained politically, socially, or psychologically. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October, they did not end the war through victory. They ended it by recognizing that continuing it would destroy what remained of the state. Russia's exit reshaped the conflict immediately. The Eastern Front collapsed, Germany gained breathing room, the balance of the war shifted. But Russia paid an enormous price. The war that broke the empire gave way to a struggle over what would replace it, a struggle that would shape the 20th century just as deeply as the fighting itself. As one great power left the war, the consequences rippled outward. vacuums formed, pressure shifted west, and the conflict entered its most volatile phase yet. In the next episode, we turn to the opposite movement. While Russia exits the war, another power steps in. We'll examine why the United States abandons neutrality, how escalation finally becomes global in scale, and why 1917 marks the moment when the war's outcome truly comes into question. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.